Okay, good morning everyone from my end. This is Pao Yui. I'm heading this Plenary 2 session together with a lot of other co-organizers that helped me putting this group together. And I'm very glad that we are able to invite you to this online session. We would of course have preferred to have this in a real conference room in Brussels, but as all of you know, this is very sadly not possible, but still I'm glad to see that there are so many participants that have already joined the first Plenary 1 and are now joining Plenary session number 2. So the topic of today's Plenary is climate neutral pathways, scenarios and storylines, useful lessons learned and strategies for the European Green Deal. We will be presenting a lot of inputs from various ongoing Horizon 2020 projects, especially Open Entrance and Navigate, but also other projects have contributed to this, and therefore we are glad to have also several other speakers, not only from Horizon 2020 projects, but also from other organizations, and are looking forward to the discussions with all of you in this upcoming hour. Please bear with us if there's still some minor complicated technical issues. As you know, there's so many different tools and so many nice opportunities as well as challenges always happening. For today's agenda, I will start off with a small introduction and then present the results of a survey that some of you might have participated in the last week already. And then we will have 4 great talks by Alessia De Vita, by Carlo Heinz, Jessica Streffler, and Jörg Mühlenhof, and Jonathan Bonaggio. So 4 different speakers presenting different results of potential pathways towards climate neutrality. As all of you know, there is not one correct scenario and wrong assumptions or right assumptions, but there's different possibilities, different opportunities, and therefore we are glad that we have the possibility to have 4 different presentations, and we might, in the discussions afterwards, try to focus a bit on what are similarities, what are maybe robust assumptions, what are things where scenarios look very different in between the models, and then trying to understand in a better way whether this is because the model type is different or whether the assumptions are different or whether some are just more updated than others. So there's a lot of things to debate. And therefore, I'm very thankful that so many of you have joined us. I see the numbers of attendees is rising even more. So I will try to be a bit slower at the beginning so that people that join a bit later don't miss too much. But at the beginning, it's anyhow, so to speak, only the results of the survey. So coming to the response of the survey, basically some of you clicked on the link when you were invited to join the session, and there were some questions that you answered, and these are basically the results. We had 50 to 60 responses to the survey. We cannot say for certain whether this is speaking for the all your opinions, but at least this is, I think, a first glimpse of what the participants of this session think of future technologies. And the first question was, when do you expect hydrogen to be applied large scale across Europe? Even though, of course, we could always debate what is exactly large scale. Still, 5 people said this could be done by 2030. The majority expects 2040 to be probably the century where hydrogen might be sufficiently applied. Some people think more of 2050, 12 people after 2050, and 6 people are a bit more pessimistic and don't think that hydrogen will play a bigger role across Europe. So therefore, we see that we have a lot of discussions on hydrogen, but the timing of this technology is still unclear. I'm slowing down a bit because I see the number of attendees is increasing even more. This, I assume, is also based on the fact that the session before that took a bit longer, so we apologize for this inconvenience. But still are glad that you have joined us. So for hydrogen, this is the situation. Then another technology, carbon capture, which has also been being discussed in the last years a lot. We asked you, what is the role of carbon capture in the energy sector to be applied as well, large scale across Europe? 2 people are very optimistic, I would say, thinking of 2030. And then we see basically a plateau of people thinking 2040, 2050, or after 2050, as well as 16 people actually saying they don't see this technology ever to make it across Europe. And we have a second question, which is actually very similar to the first question. We also asked for carbon capture, but we specified what about the industry sector? Some of you probably know this. We have CO2 emissions, especially in the steel sector, in the cement industry, which could be reduced by carbon capture. And there's the question whether we maybe should prioritize the industry sectors where there is less alternative technologies or more expensive alternative technologies compared to the energy sector, especially as we have limited storage potential. We see as well here a similar picture with respect to 2030, very low assumptions. We see in general, people expect carbon capture in the industry sector to tackle off a bit later, so more in 2050 or after 2050 in comparison to the energy sector. And this can be relatively easily explained, I would say, because the CO2 capture costs are simply more expensive in the industry sector. That's probably the assumption by most people. However, most interestingly, I think it is that less people think that carbon capture will play no role in the industry sector. So we see the setting never is chosen by 5 people for the industry sector. However, in the case for the energy sector, 16 people thought so. So even though I would interpret it in a way that people think carbon capture in the industry sector is more difficult, and this is why it will happen in a later stage, still people are more convinced that it will happen at some time in the industry sector, while some people are more skeptic that it will happen in the energy sector. I presumably think this might be because people say that it is not needed in the energy sector, while they might still see a need for it in the industry sector. It's my personal assumption, not having talked to all the participants, of course, and looking forward to your comments on this as well. Next question, what about negative emission technologies? When should they be applied? When can they be applied across Europe? One very optimistic person, 2030, but then the majority is thinking of 2050 or after 2050 only. So we see here negative emission technologies might not be the big hope in 2030. Interesting to see what the scenarios afterwards show. And then next technology, nuclear reactors. How many do you think will be built by 2050 in Europe? 9 people think that no nuclear reactor will be built. This would then also assume that the nuclear reactors that are currently under construction will not make it. Hinkley Point, but also in France as well as Finland. We have a lot of plants in Eastern European countries where it's unsure when they will come online, if they will come online at any point. We have the majority thinking of 5 reactors across Europe, or 5 to 10 reactors, and a very low amount of people thinking that there might be a new renaissance of nuclear, as anticipated, for example, there are some plans in the by the Dutch government, as some of you might have heard, something to be discussed. Last but not least, a general question, and several answers were possible. What are the 3 most important aspects to reach the target of climate neutrality? And these are the percentage points. 5% of the votes went to carbon capture technologies, 20% of the votes to the change of behavior and sufficiency. Negative emission technologies got 9% of the vote, efficiency improvements, 13% of the votes, renewables as 1/4 of the votes, storage improvements 15%, grid infrastructure only 6%, and hydrogen and other renewable gases 9%. And there might be also some other things that you wanted to have to choose from, but these were some possibilities that we gave you. And I think it gives a good mix, showing that we need a lot of different technologies. We need a lot of different other aspects as well, change of behavior and sufficiency, efficiency improvements. And there is not one solution that might solve it all. And we are very much looking forward to the upcoming speakers to give us a bit more insights what they think is the major turnaround in this session. Talking about your participation, because we don't want only me to talk, but also others to have the possibility to say and to raise their voices. We invite you to use Slido. You can either scan the QR code with your mobile device, or you can just visit slido.com, and then you have to type in EMP-E 2020. So there's a hashtag, but don't type in the hashtag, but type in EMP-E 2020, and then you have to choose Plenary 2 climate neutral pathways. And then basically we invite you to pose any kind of question or comments that you have directly into it. If you have some direct comments regarding the survey that we just posted because you agree or disagree, feel free to start already now. And we will then try to raise all the comments afterwards in the discussion section after the 4 speakers. Also, during the presentations of the 4 speakers, if you have direct questions related to one speaker or to all speakers, post them directly in the question and answer session. And if you like a question posed by someone else, feel free to like it so it gets uplifted to a higher bar so that it's more likely that we can actually ask that question afterwards. If you have any problems, please use the chat function of the GoToWebinar also. So this is something from your side. So thank you very much, first of all, for attending this session. Thank you very much, first of all, for attending my presentation slides at the beginning. And I will switch over now to the first presenter. And therefore, it is, let me just, it's my honor to present to you the first presentation by Alessia De Vita, presenting modeling carbon neutral pathways for EU Green Deal and climate neutrality by E3 modeling. And Alessia, the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes to present your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to present here. So I don't know how we're going to do it with the next slide. If I can just make a sign maybe. So we work on at E3 modeling on the primes modeling, and therefore we work mainly in an EU policy context, which means we have been working for many of the latest EU initiatives, including the Clean Energy for All Europeans in 2016 and 2018, which set the first targets for 2030. And then we worked on the Clean Planet for All strategy, which aimed at seeing the pathways for the long-term strategy of the EU, aiming at climate neutrality in by 2050, zero net emissions, CO2 emissions, with a number of pathways how to achieve it. The national energy and climate plans have come out recently in all the countries by the end of 2019, or a bit later in some cases, and presented compatible RES targets and energy efficiency ambition. And then there's the current trends, which we are seeing, aside from the ones we saw in the first session related to COVID, of coal phase out, very large renewable projects, emergence of e-mobility, and a very high interest in hydrogen and green gas. And obviously, just very recently was the Clean Targets Plan. What are, in our opinion, the questions which a model-based analysis can help to answer? So first of all, the question which, let's say, has by now been broadly positively replied, which is whether climate neutrality is viable and sustainable in the EU. And I think there is a plethora of understanding that we all agree that this is something positive and feasible in the EU. The question is then, how can we achieve this climate neutrality? I think this is the main questions. And the question would be, can it be solely achieved through conventional fuels and technology? And if not, which additional technologies will be required? And in particular, which policies will be required to achieve this? What are we talking about in terms of cost, in terms of affordability, not only in terms of the absolute costs, but costs throughout society? And then obviously, what are the kind of policy instruments which are cost effective and useful in this context? Next slide. Within our modeling, we have basically split the options, or I think not only within our modeling, but in general, between so-called no regret options and between more disruptive changes. So the question is, what can we not do any longer with conventional elements? So no regret options are obviously energy efficiency and improving buildings, enhanced renewable, large-scale integration of renewables, electrification of transport and heating where it is cost-efficient, production and of sustainable advanced biofuels, and in countries and areas which allow it, obviously the extension of long-term operation of nuclear, and where applicable also some CO2 storage where acceptable and where feasible, either for energy or for process emissions. What are the disruptive changes which will be required? If we're aiming, as we are aiming for CO2 neutrality by 2050, we will need disruptive changes, is what comes out of our modeling, which means reducing energy demand in all sectors beyond what are conventional energy savings. So we're talking circular economy, sharing of vehicles, secondary materials, recycling. It also is the question of how the use of energy will change. So high electrification in industry and in transport, possible direct use of hydrogen, the ways to distribute and to store it, as well as other let's say, GHG-free liquids or gases. Then the questions are, what are the changes in the production and the nature of the energy commodities that will be happening? Will there be a mix of hydrogen or biogas in gas distribution? Will there be a replacement of fossil gas by carbon neutral methane? And will we be replacing fossil liquids? Obviously, the capturing of CO2 from air or biomass will be required if we want to aim at this, because otherwise these fuels will not be neutral. Then the question is obviously the capturing of CO2, particularly from industrial process. Will it be sequestered to be used in other materials, or will it be only put into the earth, so to say? With the primes modeling, we have tried to explore contrasted scenarios, understanding what are the pros and cons of such contrasted scenarios. So the extreme cases that we see are things like maximum efficiency and circular economy. It's relatively non-expensive, with limited pressure on the energy supply potentials. The negative aspects of that is that it crucially depends on investments by individuals, meaning that obviously the investments will have to occur at the level of the end users. The potential is therefore somewhat uncertain. It is still unclear what are the appropriate policy signals in this regard. And obviously, the other issue is that obviously, if you have very low demand, who will actually be supplying if there is a limited, it will discourage investments in the supply side. An idea of maximum electrification, it will be efficient and convenient with relatively to the other elements that I will be presenting, a modest growth for electricity demand. However, there are sectors which cannot be fully electrified, particularly thinking of industry and transport. And there will be a lack of competition among energy carriers, creating some issues with markets. Obviously, there is also high seasonality and daily variability, as well as resulting in high balancing costs. The other two options are going towards, let's say, other energy carriers, including in the mix, which is hydrogen. Hydrogen has the potential to be a universal carrier, as well as the chemical storage of electricity. And obviously, it is less electricity intensive than e-fuels, but it requires infrastructure changes. There is uncertainty on the future costs of hydrogen and fuel cells, and there are some public acceptance issues. If we go even further and think of, let's say, carbon neutral or GHG neutral fuels, obviously the existing infrastructure can continue to be used. It still provides chemical storage for electricity. It will maintain a competition among energy carriers. However, the question is, where will the origin of the carbon be? Again, the question of what the future costs were, so the uncertainties, which I believe were part of the title of the session, is one of the big issues. From a modeling perspective, what are the challenges that we face when trying to model such aspects? These are important in the demand side. There are two big elements. One is the circular economy, where the big question is, what is the potential to decrease demand and energy demand, then in particular through circularity, through the aspects of recycling, modularity, as well as what is the elements of primary and secondary production of metals. And here we see that there is still lots of literature to be developed and lack of information, let's say, to be able to fully be able to include this, especially endogenously, let's say, in models. In terms of energy efficiency, this examines the potential of increasing the energy efficiency, particularly in things like the transport sector, where we have elements like car sharing, improved scheduling in industry, for the extent of heat recovery capabilities in industry, and obviously deeper innovation strategies in building. One has to remember that in Europe, we have the issue, which we will be seeing as I go here now through the sectors, in particular in the buildings. We have many old buildings in Europe, and there the question is, what are the costs and what are the barriers which people needing to renovating these need to face? And these are things that we have been trying to include in our modeling, so non-market barriers and idiosyncratic behaviors through a detailed segmentation of households and dwelling types. Obviously, renovations have long payback periods, and therefore also the energy equipment and the renovation, let's say, of the building shell are obviously nested choices. I mean, one will not be dependent on the other. In terms of industry, sorry, still the previous slide. There is the question of process emissions, which even the survey tackled. What do we do with the process emissions? How can these be eliminated or strongly reduced? The direct use of carbon-free hydrogen in industrial uses, because there is an upper limit to electrifying industrial uses, and obviously the other big question is we only have a limited number, particularly in the energy-intensive industries, of investment cycles until 2050. How can these be represented correctly for the different countries, etc.? What we try to do in our model is obviously to have a very high segmentation in order to capture all the peculiarities of the different industrial sectors, particularly in elements of the investment cycles. For the transport, the problems are long-distance mobility, how to include, thank you, to include the novel technologies and energy carriers. So next slide, I'll try and be very fast now. So in the supply side, the challenges are known. It's flexibility because of the very high rest shares, therefore ways to include unit commitments and capacity expansion models, synergies for the industrial sectors so that one can have simultaneously the production of new fuels, storage, and the electricity production and direct consumption of electricity. And next slide. I think, okay, these are just examples. I will dump this for now. I will go directly to my 2 slides on conclusions. What are the energy system costs and investments, which you know, such systems as we are seeing see an increase in investment, both in demand and supplies, but a reduction in energy person cost. So it's a CapEx versus OpEx question. What we see in all the scenarios that we have been modeled is obviously huge investments on the side of individuals and firms of end users of energy, which will need to be tackled also from a policy perspective. Also, investment in infrastructure is very important, whereas the actual cost of electricity production, assuming the economies of scale that are being assumed, will remain stable. Obviously, the key uncertainty in all these scenarios is obviously the learning by doing dynamics of the technologies that are not yet mature today. I would jump directly to the next slide to have the true conclusions. So obviously, what I started with, climate neutrality is obviously feasible. The cost estimations are obviously uncertain. And this also means the variation between the scenarios can be very large depending on the cost estimations which are assumed. There are no questions about the no regret options. However, it is clearly necessary to have also disruptive changes in the energy systems and strong developments of technologies which are not yet considered mature. The next decade, so now the period until 2030, is of crucial importance. We might, as the survey was saying, not be seeing all these technologies into the market until 2030, but everything needs to be ready so that we then really have them by 2040 in the system. The big question, which should be a policy priority, is what is the elements in terms of investments, how to incentivize investments by individuals and firms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and sorry for having to rush you through due to the limited time that we have for this entire session. So once again, I invite everyone to post questions to this session or to this talk as well as to the others via Slido. And we start directly now with the second talk by Carlo Heinz on the quantitative scenarios for low carbon futures in the pan-European energy system. So Carlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Poyu, and for the introduction and also the mentioning of the title. That saves me 2 seconds. So the work has been conducted in the Open Entrance project, and I'm going to give you a short rundown of our work over the last 1 year that we had. So next slide, please. Exactly. Here is a short overview of the scenario process that was conducted. So first, you can see it on the left side of the graph. The storylines were developed qualitatively, and they took a bunch of different dimensions into account, such as geopolitics, climate or energy policies, technology portfolio, or also more specific details about the energy system or the transport sector in detail. And in the next step, once these storylines were defined, they were quantified. No, go one slide back. Exactly. They were quantified and used as input data into the Global Energy System Model Genesis mod. And at the same time, the storylines on the quantitative and the qualitative side, as well as the results from model calculations, were then compared to existing message globium scenario results to ensure consistency across the different models being used in this exercise. Now, all of this data in later stages of the project will be made publicly available. There will also be a session at the EMP-E later this week where this will be a topic. And will be used in a bunch of case studies. Now, on the next slide, we can see for the 4 different pathways that actually were developed, and they can be placed in this 3-dimensional space with the 3 dimensions. One is the policy exertion, technology novelty, and smart society. And within this dimensions, we placed 3 1.5-degree compliance scenarios, namely directed transition, where a strong policy push exists and policy has to take a lot of action. Societal commitment, where society is more sustainable and more willing to take action. And the techno-friendly scenario, which has nothing to do with music, but is more about a high degree of technological development, as well as the allowance of breakthrough technologies, or if you want to compare it to the talk we just heard, more the disruptive events. And then apart from the 3 1.5-degree scenarios, there's also a 2-degree scenario called gradual development, which has a little bit of everything in there, but to a lesser degree and is a less ambitious one. Next slide, please. Right, here are some more like model-specific specifications of Genesis mod, which we used. Basically, Europe was split up into 30 regions, all of mainland EU plus additional countries. Only the Balkan region was aggregated into one single region. Years from 2015 to 2050 were calculated. The sectors, electricity, buildings, industry, and transportation are depicted. And then depending on which pathway is being calculated, there's pathway-dependent features, obviously consistent with the input assumptions. And we jump directly into the results. Now, this slide shows primary energy consumption across all 4 scenarios. And the first impression is there doesn't change that much. They all look very similar. And that's also one of the first takeaways we can take here, is that it doesn't really matter which pathway at the end seems to be the closest to the truth, or even the 2-degree pathway. There is not that much wiggle room when we want to be climate compliant. 1.5 or 2 degree doesn't really matter here. Now, going a little bit more into detail on this slide here, we can see at the left side, we see the pathways directed transition and techno-friendly. So the first one being or having a very strong policy push, the second one being technology driven. And those are the only 2 pathways where in the later stages of the modeling period, there is still relevant amounts of fossil fuels in the energy system. And that's basically because CCS technologies are allowed, or not only allowed, but also economically feasible in these pathways. While if these technologies aren't available, like in the societal commitment one, we see that basically 100% renewable plus storages are a necessity. On the next slide, there is a comparison of the 4 pathways, which basically just shows one additional feature which wasn't really seeable in the previous slide, and that's that the pathway societal commitment, so the colors stay the same over the whole presentation now, the societal commitment pathway is the lowest one when it comes to total amounts of primary energy demand, which is mainly attributed to the reduced demand. So what we saw here is that the demand reduction had a higher influence in the overall energy demand than, for example, efficiency improvement in technologies or a policy push. Next slide, we can see on the left-hand side the electricity generation. On the right-hand side, we can see annual emissions, again, per pathway. Obviously, while the primary energy demand decreased in the slide before because of higher electrification rates in other sectors which currently are fossil fuel dominated, and therefore electricity-based solutions have higher efficiency usually when it comes to energy conversion, this obviously leads to a steep increase of electricity which is required to be produced, which is what we can see on the left-hand side. I give you just like a short or some small interesting stuff. On the left-hand side, the yellow dots, which is the techno-friendly pathway, is the pathway where Overall, the least amount of required electricity can be found, which can be attributed to better efficiency assumptions than in the other scenarios, and doesn't really mean that there is less electrification. It's just that the efficiency there is higher. Interestingly, also on the left graph, the directed transition pathway, which are the green dots, in the intermediate part of the medium term of the modeling period, has the highest amount of required electricity which is being produced, while then once 2040 arrives, it stays rather stable and doesn't change more, and then the overall hierarchy changes. And the reason for that is that in 2040 there is a very important climate target, which is by 2040 there is emission, or basically net zero emissions, which we can see on the right hand side for all pathways except the gradual development one. And this leads to a lot of action, especially in the directed transition pathway, which then later is not really required anymore in the model calculations, because the climate target then is achieved and we don't see any further developments in either technological parameters or in demand patterns. On the next slide, which should be the second to last one, we can see a very similar trend. On the left-hand side is now the installed capacities in the power sector, and on the bottom of the same graph, the installed capacity when it comes to storages, so flexibility options. And on the right-hand side, we see hydrogen production. And an interesting takeaway that we also found out here is that the hydrogen production seems to be one major contributor to the development of the power production, and in this case here, also the installed capacities in the power sector. Taking, for example, again, the directed transition pathway, which are the green dots, we can see that the installed capacities in the directed transition pathway on the left-hand side also usually are on the higher end, and once 2040 arrives, they are on the lower end, again, consistent with what we saw on the slide before, while the other scenarios like gradual development one or societal commitment one, which have very high amounts of hydrogen in later periods, also require very high amount of capacities installed. Techno-friendly, again, is the odd child out, because higher conversion efficiencies, which allow a high amount of produced hydrogen, but with lesser capacities required. And on the next slide, there should already be my concluding remarks. Exactly. So scenarios and pathways are a very suitable tool to project different future developments, as long as the comparison afterwards takes this into account. Our 4 open entrance pathways, they all show basically a substantial need to accelerate climate action. They all go into the same direction. I couldn't show a lot of other results, but a lot of them are very similar with nuances. And difference in these pathways, they arise from the different scenarios. And one important thing is that none of them is clearly favorable, and in the end, it will be a mixture of all of them. But they all come with their own challenges. And one last point is that openness and transparency of scientific research is really a necessity and can really help with these challenges ahead. Again, another session later this week. But with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to pass over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Carlo, for sticking to the time and this great presentation. And now we will hand over directly to the third speaker. Also, I see that questions keep coming. So it's very good. In Slido, please also, if you have it directed to one speaker in particular, note the name of the speaker so that we know whom to ask that question to. This is just, otherwise we will ask all of the people, which is also not a big problem, but just for that. But handing over to Jessica Strefler from PIC, giving her presentation on the pathways to emissions neutrality, also a product of Navigate.
Thanks, Payu, for the perfect introduction. So we can jump right into things. If I may have the next slide, please. So if we look at pathways to emissions, or here to carbon neutrality, they usually look something like this, where emissions from electricity supply side, here shown in yellow, are phased out quite quickly, but emissions from the demand side, here shown in the blue shades, are taking a bit longer. So you see here from the bottom to the top, transport, buildings, and industry emissions. But to actually achieve carbon neutrality, we need to offset the residual emissions, and that is done by carbon dioxide removal, here shown in green. And while the general structure of these pathways always looks similar, could you please take the mouse out of the screen? It's kind of confusing. Thanks. where the general structure of the pathways always looks kind of similar, there's still quite some uncertainties around the exact shape of the pathways. And one of these uncertainties relates to carbon dioxide removal, to CDR, or sometimes also called net negative or negative emission technologies. So I've said that we need to offset the remaining residual emissions to go to net zero, but the distribution, how much do we mitigate and how much do we offset, that's something that we're only just starting to talk about. And there are still considerable uncertainties around the potential of carbon removal. So how much can we do, which options do we have, and also which policies do we need to incentivize carbon removal? So for example, do we want to include it in the European emissions trading scheme? Do we want revenues to be less than the carbon price? Or do we want something completely different where we, for example, fix the amount of carbon removal and then fill it via competitive bidding? So there's still quite some uncertainties, but a robust strategy here would be to limit our dependency on carbon removal by reducing emissions as quickly and as deeply as possible, while at the same time investing into research and development so we have it available when needed. A second key uncertainty is the energy demand. So that relates to questions around energy efficiency, electrification, but also around lifestyle changes. And while there have been studies about behavioral changes in single sectors, something that like a cross-sectoral lifestyle change with consistent narratives is still missing. And that's one of the key research frontiers in Navigate, where we also aim to include these lifestyle changes in integrated assessment models to answer some of the most pressing questions. But as Navigate has only just started a couple of months ago, I would ask you to keep an eye on the coming Navigate results. But here in this talk, I will look at something different. And that's the third point, emission reductions in single sectors. And one sector that's particularly difficult to decarbonize is the industry sector. Next slide, please. So here you see the energy demand in different industry subsectors and the electricity share. So the horizontal bars, they represent different sectors. So for example, the chemicals or cement and steel industry. And the size of the bars represent the share of the energy used in the sector. So for example, the large upper bar, that's the chemical industry, and it's using more than 50% of total energy. Next slide, please. And perfect. And the yellow share that you see, that's the current share of electricity, and it's right now about 19%. Next, please. If we would exploit already the entry points, for example, thermal processes that are easy to electrify, then we could more than double this electricity share and reach an additional 23% of electricity. Next, please. If we would exploit all the already fully developed and established processes and sector-specific technologies, we could add another 8% of electricity. Next, please. And if we finally exploit the maximum achievable electrification potential, then we could also electrify some of the harder processes in the steel and cement industries. Next, please. And with these electrification technologies, electrification could almost entirely abate the energy-related CO2 emissions. That, of course, excludes the feedstocks. That excludes the feedstocks. That's a large gray area in the upper right corner that's responsible for 40%. But the energy-related CO2 emissions in the fossil fuels could almost entirely abate it with electrification. Now, next slide, please. But if we are talking about climate neutrality in 2050, we are not only talking about how far can we reduce emissions, but also how fast can we reduce emissions. And this target of climate neutrality in 2050 implies a strengthening of the 2030 targets. And that's what the EU is discussing currently. So right now, the 2030 target is minus 40%, and the current proposal is minus 55%. And one important question is then, how do we distribute the additional mitigation across the ETS and the ESR? Right now, for -40%, the target is -43% in the ETS and -30% in the ESR. And that implies carbon prices of 30 to 60 euros per ton of CO2 in the ETS and much higher carbon prices of 150 to 250 euros per ton in the ESR. Next slide, please. Next, please. Yeah. If we now increase the target from -40 to -55%, and we were to keep the current split between ETS and ETR, we would double the CO2 prices in both sectors, a bit more in the ESR sector. So that would lead to prices of 60 to 140 euros per ton of CO2 in the ETS, but prices of more than 400 euros per ton of CO2 in the ESR. And just a quick side note here, the colors denote the pressure in the system, and we assume that the ESR target is reached in EU-wide cooperation. If we would not keep the current split, next slide, please, but do all these additional reductions, so the jump from 40 to 55% in the ETS sector only, we would get only a moderate increase from these 60 to 140 euros per ton of CO2 to 75 to 200 euros per ton of CO2, while the price in the ESR would stay roughly the same. So with this split, we would get a more even distribution between the two sectors. Next slide, please. If we go not to -55%, but to -60%, that difference is even more pronounced. Next slide, please. So these numbers were assuming, so maybe a note of caution here, these are only preliminary results from the Remind model. And these results were without additional policy instruments. If we had not only the carbon price, but also additional policy instruments like tailored policies or more efficiency measures, the price in the ESR could be reduced below the numbers that I just showed. Next slide, please. If you're interested in these kinds of splits and you have further questions and would like to discuss that in a bit more depth, there is a poster shown by Robert Pietzka tomorrow at 3 in the room Rome. So please check out his poster. And with this, I'm already at the end. So let me please quickly summarize. There are still large uncertainties regarding the distribution of mitigation and offsets via carbon removal, and also regarding carbon removal potential options and policies. To achieve carbon neutrality, it's important that we exploit all the reduction potentials in all of the sectors. For example, in the industry sector, we've seen that electrification could almost entirely abate the energy-related CO2 emissions. And it's also, if we look at the 2030 targets, it's crucial to leverage the potential of the ETS and avoid an overburdening of the ESR. And in this context, we may also want to think about additional policies to reduce the pressure in the ESR. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you very much for this great talk. Also, just 2 comments from my side, which I forgot to say before. First of all, just for everyone to know, we're now 170 people attending this conference. So this is something that not everyone can see, but I think it's important for people to know that there are quite some people listening to us. Second, also, I'm not sure whether I said it, so I'll say it again. We are recording this entire session. So this is just for you to know, and we have to inform you of this. Now we're coming to the 4th input, and for this, I'm handing over the control to Jörg Mühlenhof, who will give the next talk together with Jonathan Bonaggio about their Paris Agreement scenario and the Paris Agreement compatible PAC scenarios that they have performed, and looking forward to your input.
Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Jörg Mühlenhof. I speak on behalf of Climate Action Network Europe, Can Europe, and together with my colleague Jonathan Bonaggio from the European Environmental Bureau, EB, we are the only speakers who do not come directly from a research institute, because we present a truly civil society-led scenario, this PAC scenario, which is a special one because it was built together with our members from more than 150 European environmental NGOs during the last 1.5 years. And we did this in a participatory approach, meaning that we did not first commission a huge study in a multi-annual, multi-million euro research project. We did it in a kind of grassroots approach. We discussed with our members key assumptions that we would like to see implemented in our own scenario. Our starting point was, of course, the urgency of reducing immediately emissions, following, of course, the 1.5 degree special report of the IPCC, and also the United Nations Environmental Programme emission gap report that tells us that we basically have to cut our emissions of greenhouse gases per year by more than 7%. So how would this pathway look like? When we as environmental NGOs in Brussels, when we talk to policymakers, we often hear this sentence, yeah, you as environmental NGOs, you have an easy job because you always just ask for higher targets, for higher ambition, but you actually never explain how to get there. And we just wanted also to answer to this kind of reproach and show a very consistent, robust and science-based pathway towards the emission reductions that we need by 2040, reaching net zero emissions in the EU, with 65% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030 already, in contrast to what the European Commission just has put on the table. Actually, you know, we are discussing a 55% reduction target by the year 2030. So we did this, as I said, in a kind of grassroots approach with a series of workshops. We invited experts to compare studies, existing models, and to discuss how this can be integrated, how this is in line with the other policy demands and the other wishes that environmental NGOs have with regards to our future energy landscape. And of course, we were not the first, neither the only ones to do this exercise. This is an opportunity also for me to thank all the partners who helped us to provide intelligence, to share models and results from existing studies that we partly took over and integrated into our key assumptions. So I will now hand over to my colleague Jonathan to explain a bit more our approach, how we built this scenario.
So thanks indeed, Jörg, and good morning, everyone. Thanks again also for the invitation and the very interesting presentation that we had here. I'm Jonathan Bonadio from the European Environmental Bureau. We are also a grassroots organization, more than 160 members across Europe, tackling different environmental issues, climate, energy, of course, but also agriculture, forestry, and chemicals, etc., etc. So we have a broad range of expertise. I will briefly present how we built the PAC scenario, Paris Agreement compatible scenario. So we started, as Jörg explained, as a very grassroots exercise, analyzing literature, discussing with experts, discussing with policy experts, and trying to build what would the energy system of the future look like in terms of demand, and then matching the demand, of course, with sustainable supplies based on inputs by our members. So it was a very grassroots exercise, balancing demand and supply on a yearly basis, following Eurostat methodology as much as possible, and checking then against our policy ask and targets in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, energy efficiency, and renewables. We had a complementary approach provided by partners Öko Institute or Research Institute Öko Institute that worked with us to deepen, narrow the analysis to have a more granular approach at hourly basis, and to basically say that this kind of energy system could work for the future also on hourly basis in the electricity system. On the next slide, I think this is very important to say that here, especially in this modeling conference, we have to remain humble. We are NGOs. We have built this exercise with input of experts and literature. So we have collected a lot of numbers. We have collected a lot of feedback from members, but there are things that we still need to learn from the modeling community. We still need to improve, or we still need to discuss. We don't have, as Alexia has presented on Prime, we don't have a global or partial equilibrium in energy model. It's more about an exercise of balancing and checking if the demand matches supply. we don't have national or local optimization of installation, renewable supply at hourly basis, and we don't have a complete grid model either. And this is something we had, of course, to maybe go further. The big lesson, and this I will stop here. The big lesson of the PAC scenario is that basically it is feasible. I mean, I remember what Alessia from Prime says, checking Prime, so checking viability and sustainability. We are checking feasibility, technical feasibility. It's feasible to go to 2040 net zero by dividing energy demand by 2. As the graph say here, we will go further in details. And it's also feasible to match this demand with a supply in the next slide, with a high rate of electrification, penetration of heat pumps and electric heating, and a slight amount also of non-fossil fuels and gases. We'll go also further in the analysis in the next slides. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Jörg, who will present a bit more how we determine the demand of several sectors and how we led to our analysis. Thanks.
Yeah, you see here the final energy demand for the EU 28, including all sectors. I will take you very quickly through the different distinct sectors, starting with the industry sector. There, the big headline for industry is, first of all, the circular economy approach, which means that our raw material demand will reduce in the future, which also leads to reduction of final energy demand in the industry. And as Jessica Schreffler from PIC just explained in the beginning, it is very important to electrify those processes in industry that you can electrify with electricity. We assume that this will indeed happen, while those sectors in steel and chemicals industry where you need an energy carrier with a high energy density to reach high temperatures, there we see an introduction of renewable hydrogen to a certain extent. The big headline for the buildings we are living in the residential sector is the deep renovation wave. The deep renovation wave means that the final energy demand massively decreases in the buildings through better insulation and increasing the share of the building stock that is renovated from 1% to up to 3%. And this at the same time is the perfect opportunity to also remove the inefficient individual fossil fuel heating systems like fossil gas boilers and replace them with either electric heat pumps or with a connection to a district heating network that can supply other sources of renewable heat. The same trend, deep renovation wave, also applies to the buildings in the public sector, tertiary sector. In the agriculture sector, the big headline is that we switch from fossil oil products to sustainably sourced bioenergy that is coming as a waste or residue as a co or byproduct from the processes of agriculture and forestry. A few notes on the transport sector from Jonathan in the end.
Yep, thanks indeed. So for the transport sector, I think the picture is clear. I would allow myself to quote Carlo on this, that there is no much wriggle room when we want to go for 1.5 degrees. I mean, we will have to transition for a 93%, 95% fossil-based energy supply and transport to a fully renewable and zero carbon by 2040. So which means that electrification here would be key. And as we have seen in the very interesting poll in the beginning, I mean, most people believe that the hydrogen takeoff would only start in 2040 and onwards, and upwards, sorry. So we cannot wait for these technologies to be ready to decarbonize the transport sector and hence the electricity here and some non-fossil fuels for heavy duty transport.
And as you see in all sectors, the blue slice for electricity is quite important. And you might ask yourself, what is the electricity mix? There we see a doubling of the electricity generation thanks to cheap solar PV and wind, which is available across the entire continent. And you see that this is even a bit below the increase of electricity generation that Carlo just presented from the Open Entrance project. You might ask yourself, what about adequacy? This is what we double checked then with the Öko Institute electricity market model already introduced. We also stress that it's not only about quantitatively increasing renewables, but also in a qualitative way, ensuring that we have more flexibility options. The learning is that flexible fossil power plants as a kind of backup are barely needed in 2030 with such a huge increase of renewables. We rather need more grid extension on the transmission and distribution grid level. To a certain extent, dispatchable renewables can jump and fill in this gap whenever the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. But demand response, be it in households or industry, as well as storage technologies, last but not least, will be the most important pillars of such a flexible 100% renewable energy system to reach net zero emissions. And we close with 10 minutes now full. We, of course, are an open learning project. We still have a number of open questions that we will dig deeper into during the next months regarding, for example, country-specific scenarios. We do not yet have specific results regarding costs and benefits on the macroeconomic level, and we also started recently a new research project with climate models to get more into the details of emission reduction pathways. We are happy to exchange with you, and you can find the scenarios for download also on the website under an open license. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, and I think it's really valuable also that we have not only the inputs by academia, by us always, but also that we give other actors the possibility to share their inputs. So back to me, and please bear with me for the last 10 minutes, answering some of the last remaining open questions. You can see on my screen ranked the questions that were ranked the highest by the audience group. I will read out a couple of questions, and then I would simply ask the speakers to go around and to have the possibility to respond to all the questions they want to respond to. They can, of course, also pick what they want to respond to and use this at the same time for the last final statements, because we won't have time for a second round. But I will first of all read out the questions loud because I'm not sure that everyone can see my screen sufficiently. So the first question, which was supported by 11 people by Robbie Morrison, is: are there any plans for Primes to open source its code base, open its issues trackers, and publish key data sets, which is of course directed to Alessia De Vita. Then another comment supported by 6 people: it would be nice to have a forum to coordinate and compare pathways, results, and assumptions, a hub or nexus to unite energy models. What do you think? This is a question that I can maybe directly answer. There's an open call by Horizon 2020 to fund such a project, a European modeling forum, or however you want to call it, from next year onwards. So I assume that a lot of people that are in this call have applied for this. So looking forward to the decision by the Commission who will get this, but there might be something like this coming in the future. Another question: are biofuels really a non-regret option? What about the climate land use related trade-offs of its entails? So what about biofuels? Another question: what are your current approaches to calibrate various behavioral lifestyle changes into your respective models? Can you provide examples on sector levels? Also a very interesting question. There's also another plenary tomorrow looking at socio-political and socio-economic drivers and how far this is modeled for tomorrow, plenary 3. Next question: it would be nice, this is another one, people are voting, which is good. Johannes Terma put a question: high ambition scenarios showed a focus on demand side. Tech efficiency is costly and difficult in all sectors. More focus on behavior and necessary policy, question mark. And a question by Diego Garcia: are there modeling exercises considering degrowth, GDP-based, as criticism of the conventional exogenous rationale for a priori assumed growth? So does anyone have this? A question directly referring to Carlo: what method did you use to quantify the qualitative storylines? And I'm taking 2 last questions, and then people have around to respond. By Dave Quirk: it is difficult to see how the economics and scale of CCS will ever be viable for the energy sector. That's more of a comment, I think. And by Miguel Chang, a last comment or question: to what extent are non-EU 28 countries, Norway, Switzerland, Balkans, included in the primes analysis, and what modeling detail resolution is considered for these? So therefore, so much about these things. I would propose that we take the same order as before to give everyone the possibility to speak. So I would pass around first to Alessia De Vita to respond to any question that you want to refer to. Alessia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, the most liked question seems to be the one about the primes model, so I will reply there. No, the model is not open source. However, there is the full mathematics in the model, so I think whoever really wants to look at the mathematics of the model, there is a number of issues there. Key data sets are published in a number of places, including one publication on, I guess, the Europa website within a project called Asset, where we did stakeholder consultations, which have also been repeated later in stage, but the results of the latest stakeholder consultation are not yet public. But there are all the assumptions about the key techno-economic assumptions. I'm not sure what an issues tracker is, but okay. Further, I mean, in projects such as Commit or that will be published, but in Miles, CD Links, Ampere, there are actually publicly available databases of primes results. Obviously, not of the official ones of the Commission, which are owned by the Commission, but of other things. Lifestyle changes, obviously this is a rather difficult question. On the one side, we try to have agents in the model in order to capture things like heterogeneous behaviors, also in investments, things like high and low income classes. I believe are particularly important, especially when we're looking at the demand side, as well as obviously we do a lot of research, and we are actually starting in H2020 trying to look exactly at the new trends which will be happening, which are expected to happen, and how these can be captured in models, in particular presumers and other elements. Okay, biofuels is obviously a very controversial topic. There are alternatives. The problem is, I think the big, let's say, elephant in the room when talking of biofuels is mainly, obviously, we only have limited amounts of them. We do have cooperations with land use models, etc., within the exercises we do to check what happens there. So, yeah, it's obviously controversial, and the big elephant is always what to do with the transport sector if you don't have the biofuels. Regarding the resolution of the model, just very quickly, yes, the model has Norway, Switzerland, Balkans. We actually have further other, basically almost also all the EFTA and the energy community countries by now in the modeling. Because we now have a unit commitment within the model, we obviously have Norway and Switzerland basically running, at least on the supply side, let's say all the time, because they are pretty essential when one does looks at what happens with renewables and balancing. So in reality, we have also full model resolution also for all the non-EU countries within the European scale. I think, yeah, and if you see, there is the question also further down on the different strategies. Yes, if one looks at combining strategies, we have done many scenarios also, obviously, of combining the strategies. The things I presented were more, let's say, the extreme elements.
Yeah, thank you very much. Then handing over to Carlo.
Okay, thank you. I will first answer the question which was asked to me directly. So what method did you use to quantify the qualitative storylines? As mentioned in my presentation, the qualitative storylines, they were developed keeping a number of dimensions in mind. These number, or like I can give you maybe a short number, or like the whole list. So the list of all the dimensions were geopolitics, climate and energy policies, technology portfolio, societies, attitude and lifestyle, and the energy and the transport sector in detail. And taking these, what in the scenario exercise first was done was to put together a very comprehensive list of different changes across or how one or certain aspects in these sectors develop in the respective scenarios. And then when it came into for the translation into the modeling, is first we computed some sort of baseline scenario where we took average development of all our different parameters as our baseline, computed these, and once we thought that this one is basically a good starting point, then from there we started deviating into the different directions depending on what scenario it is. So that was basically this. So it was an iterative process which went back and forward. But yeah, that was basically this. Then going or trying to answer a little bit other questions. What are our current approaches to calibrate various behavioral lifestyle changes into our respective models? Obviously, this is a topic which is starting to rise over the last couple of years, especially in the more technology-focused energy system models like we're also using. Giving examples of different sectors that we're using, for example, in the power sector, what we're basically allowing for to a certain degree is having an model-based demand shift. So our demand, which usually is given exogenously, is allowed to be shifted slightly from certain hours into others. Obviously, this is a limited amount, and basically the idea is that that through the advance of more technology of smart meters, that the technology usage, electricity usage, can actually be transferred into hours where it makes more sense. Another example would be that in the transportation sector, taking into account more car sharing or carpooling. What this would mean from a technical point would actually be the car sharing basically translates to less cars which are being purchased. We do not consider any space constraints in city, but less cars purchased still is less investments. Or in flip side, one car can drive more kilometers per year. And what carpooling does is that the efficiency of a car actually is higher because more people are inside there. So these are some of the of methods that we use to try to translate these more soft factors into a language which our model can understand, which is not always possible or easy. And I don't know if there's another question.
Otherwise, we'll also just leave it to the others.
Sure, we can also just go to others.
Sorry for that. So handing over to Jessica.
Yeah, so I would also pick 3 questions. Maybe start with the one that Carlo just answered and say that from the point of view from another model, from the remake model. So if you look at behavioral changes, for example, we are developing now a quite detailed transport model where we have all the different modes of transportations: walking, cycling, public transport, cars, trains, airplanes. And then we develop different narratives how the behavior could change. For example, something like that the majority of ways below 5 kilometers are not taken by car anymore, but by walking and cycling or public transport. And so we develop different narratives that lead to a modal shift in transportation. And that modal shift leads to different transport energy demands. So that's one example what we're doing in the Navigate project as well. There was another question on the demand side. I think it was further down below that the ambitious scenarios show reductions of demand side. Yeah, focus on demand side and tech efficiency is costly. If we need more focus on behavior and necessary policy, I don't see that as contradictions. So if you look at the different sectors, for example, for the transport sector or for the agricultural sector, I would say yes, there's lots of room for behavioral change. If we change the way we are the things we're eating, the way we are organizing our transport, I think there's lots of room for behavioral change. If you think about the industry sector, I think there's hardly any. And that's where we do need the tech and efficiency things. Same holds for the electricity sector. There's probably very little to be done by demand side. Of course, you can reduce the amount of electricity, but the way electricity is produced is not changed by behavior. And buildings is maybe somewhere in between. So I would say that both of this is necessary. And I would agree to that extent that the behavioral change has received less focus than the technological side, and that's something that we definitely need to look at more in the future. And maybe I think, yeah, there was a question regarding degrowth further up. So I think there's quite a few scenarios actually looking into degrowth. And I think there's several reasons for that. One is that we don't see any signs in reality that there's actually something like degrowth happening. And maybe another reason is that I would say we need more basic economic research to have a coherent economic theory that we could actually include in our models. So to answer the question, I'm not aware of any modeling exercise considering degrowth right now. That's it from my side.
Thank you very much. Then last but not least, I would hand over to Jörg and Jonathan. And
Yes, thank you. Maybe I can briefly touch upon the question of lifestyle changes, because we intensively discussed this issue with members and experts, checking also some other existing studies and works. Our findings were that we integrated to a certain extent future lifestyle changes with regards to households who would adopt certain new so-called smart technologies with regards to digitization. There is, of course, a potential for future efficiency gains, for energy savings. However, we were also a bit reluctant and did not assume that the full potential that we saw in certain studies would be deployed, because we are aware of those rebound effects that might occur with regards to digitalization. We also assumed that consumers would, for example, adopt certain sharing economies, as already mentioned, to a certain extent. That also has an impact on modal shift. It has an impact on transport. We assume also in the PAC scenario in the building sector that for the buildings we are living in the future, Europeans would partially reduce the average space available in their flats. So the number of square meters available would drop a little bit, taking into account urbanization trends and other macroeconomic trends that push this kind of figure. With regards to degrowth, that was also discussed, but we wouldn't call our scenario a degrowth scenario, while, however, of course, it includes certain disruptive changes. And obviously, our scenario is also a call to policymakers to ensure the appropriate legal, regulatory, legislative frameworks to achieve a quick phase out of fossil fuels. Otherwise, this energy transition, of course, is not a self-propelling item, and we need stable investment frameworks, a better energy market design, and clear targets, higher targets with regards to energy and climate, of course.
Yep. So, Paul, shall I say just a very quick word to complement a bit of what Jörg said and what have been discussed? I think there is indeed a very interesting question about this degrowth debate, behavioral changes. So where should we put the balance between technology and markets, and where should we put the balance between like counting on people's behavior to just make the change? We have been quite agnostic in our PAC scenario regarding growth and degrowth for a very pragmatic question that Jessica pointed, that we don't have real robust, comprehensive energy system-wide science-based on the whole degrowth into the energy system. So we base our analysis on this. And we still have energy services, be it transport activity or other that Jörg mentioned, that are kept equal or even slightly growing in the future. That being said, we are aware that we are living also in a world of limited resources. As environmental NGO, we would be extremely glad to move forward with our scenario and to go a bit beyond the energy system itself, also go to land use, to resources, be it rare earth, mineral, etc., to see to what extent such a rapid ramp up of renewables, of battery electric vehicle could be also compatible with our targets of conservation and biodiversity, etc., etc. So far, we are confident, but of course, it would be also glad to have a bit more evidence and further work on this. So Jessica mentioned the fact that there is no currently science-based approach. I just allow myself also to mention a project, Horizon 2020 project. We are working on the DEB, which is the locomotion project, trying to analyze the evolution of the overall resource and resources use in a context of energy transition. And I believe this might in the future also be part of the answer to these extremely important questions on how to make the system sustainable.
Thank you very much for this input. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks for all the participants who are still joining us. Sorry for being a bit overdue, but also because we started a bit later, so I think this is fine. So as you can see on the screen, this next item is basically the lunch break. So I hope that you have some lunch prepared for you because we don't have a joint lunch. However, you can visit the projects and models videos on YouTube channels, and there's a free discussion launch which you can join. And then we will reconvene in 2 different focus groups at 1:30, so in about 1 hour. You can either discuss climate neutrality, energy modeling, weather and climate, and how far can we combine these 2 elements, which are used to be 2 different communities, and we want to combine them in some kind of way. Or the focus group 2, circularity, use of raw materials. So you could choose to join either of these focus groups. And then of course at 3 o'clock, don't miss the poster launch. And then those who cannot make it this afternoon, at least join tomorrow again. There's a discussion launch early in the morning, but then the first plenary starts at 10 o'clock, looking at social and economic impacts of the transition. So once again, tackling a lot of issues that have been raised today will be hopefully at least partially answered tomorrow. So thanks especially to all the organizers as well, especially to Sebastian Zwickel also, who was managing Slido in the background, and Hans Auer, who's taking notes, which is not that easy because there was so much input on this. So, but thank you very much, everyone, and looking forward to further discussion the next days and the next years anyhow. Bye.